Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and what we are taking a look at today is a little-known French infantry weapon of World War I. This is the Municion Lancée à Main Pierre, model of 1889. It was, of course, developed before World War I, but it's one of those interesting weapons that would go through a number of simplifications during the Great War. So my own interest in this actually began when I uncovered a picture of one, a vintage picture of one, in the trenches actually being used. And it really piqued my curiosity as to, what was this and how was it developed and where was it used? And by the way, I would really like to thank a friend of the channel named Staghounds for his help in doing research on this. His work really was invaluable in helping to uncover the whole story here. So, as I said, this is the L.M.P, the Lance à Main Pierre model of 1889, and it was actually developed from a prior weapon. That was the Municion Trébuchet Bloc de Rocher model of 1873. It had originally been developed as basically an urban combat weapon during the Paris Commune in 1871, was found to be quite successful, and so after the end of the Franco-Prussian War and the end of the Paris Commune, they standardized this into more of a regular weapon and adopted it for military service in 1873. Now that would be followed 15 years later by an infantry version. Obviously the Municion Trébuchet was very effective, but it required a substantial launching infrastructure, big launching weapon to actually use it, and that wasn't something that troops could carry with them at the front. Now, despite being an infantry weapon, this wasn't issued in very large numbers. Like with the French attitude towards things like machine guns and heavy artillery, there was a heavy emphasis on the strategy or the tactics of attack. Attack basically at all costs and or at every opportunity. And the army which had the most will to fight and the best will to attack would be the one that would prevail. This was French doctrine going into World War I, and of course, unfortunately, it would be proven terribly flawed by the more modern technology of the war. So going into World War I, these were only being issued at a rate of something like 20 per company. And that would prove grossly insufficient after the huge losses of 1914 and the stagnation in 1915 of the war into trench warfare conditions. You will see the French start to push much more for development and manufacture of defensive sort of weapons like heavy machine guns, heavy artillery, and the L.M.P. 89. Now, these were only at that point being manufactured at one single facility. That was the Manufacture Nationale du Grany, outside of Vincennes, near Paris, and their production would be heavily overtaxed by the increased demand for these weapons. So in 1916, they would actually simplify this, and what we have here is the original 1889 pattern with this really beautifully cast brass carry handle on it. That would be much simplified to a synthetic material called galilée. I think I'm pronouncing that right, which is this really interesting chemical process, actually treating casein protein with formaldehyde and resulting in something kind of akin to a bakelite or a plastic. So they would adopt that, and with those handles, this would become known as the L.M.P. 1889/16. Now, at the same time that simplifications were being made to the standard in France, there was also an attempt to outsource production of this weapon. The United States was a potential immense source of munitions supply to France during the Great War. So there was actually a contract written up and signed with the Boutwell Mill and Vernum Granite Company in Vermont to produce L.M.P. 89s. Unfortunately, as with Remington production of the Berthier, there would be serious quality control and delivery problems. The delivery on the contract was substantially late. BMV was just not able to maintain the standards and the quantity that the French required. And so that contract was ultimately canceled. Very few of those LMPs actually exist to this day. Most of them were destroyed during the war. As 1917 came and went, supply issues really became quite dire, and the factory outside Vincennes, the Grany du Mort, as it was known, just couldn't handle the demand for the L.M.P. 8916s. And so the Clemenceau government decided to take a different route, and they actually started to contract with a labor organization in the Champagne region. This was the Société Anonyme des Carriers de Craie, Tableaux Noirs et des Usines d'Utiles Minières. They were better known as the Poulpe Blanc. They controlled a substantial amount of the production in that area. And what they did, the society, along with the cooperation of wounded veterans and mine workers, put together, they developed a replacement for the L.M.P. 89 that was actually made out of chalk instead of granite. They found that while this was a lot less dense, what they were able to do is increase the size, which gave it effectively the same weight as the smaller granite 89s and 8916s, and in field testing was found to have the same actual practical lethality. Larger and less dense as opposed to smaller and denser, they worked out to be basically the same in the field. So they also replaced those really quite fragile synthetic Galilith handles with just plain wood. Really something that you would have expected to have been done, honestly, even before the war started. You know, the use of a solid cast brass handle on what is ultimately a single-use weapon really seems kind of ludicrous to us today, but that was French munitions in the Belle Epoque. And so finally in 1918, they go to a wooden handle, you know, kind of the obvious solution. Anyway, formally adopted as the L.M.P. 1889/16/18. These were approved and adopted by the French military in mid-March of 1918. Ironically, just on the eve of German Operation Michael. This was, of course, the Germans' last-ditch push to try and win the war, or at least win favorable terms for an armistice before so many American troops arrived on the continent that, you know, there was no further hope for a successful German offensive. Operation Michael, of course, was largely taking place in the Champagne region, which is exactly where they were producing the new L.M.P. 8916-18. And so in a turn of events that kind of mirrors what would happen in the Soviet Union in World War II with submachine gun production in Leningrad and tank production, these would often go basically straight from the factory, the mine in the factory, right onto the front lines for use. Just like those submachine guns coming out one end of a factory in Leningrad and going straight into combat. Once Operation Michael slowed down and the front lines were stabilized again, production was finally also able to be stabilized and really picked up as they had intended. And the new L.M.P. 18 proved to be pretty popular, particularly with troops in the mountainous regions towards the Swiss border. Obviously, the more elevation you have, the more effective this is going to be. In fact, it was effective enough that the French troops started nicknaming this the pulvérisé Rocher, and it was so successful that the German Ordnance Corps actually decided to adopt their own version of it. This was named the Großessteinstück Leutezuwerfen Art 18. I think I probably butchered that, but we'll call it the GL-18. And while substantial numbers had been produced by the end of the war, the logistical system at the time was such that they were unable to actually provide any to the front before the armistice in 1918. And so they never actually saw combat use. However, they would prove to be rather popular with the Freikorps, and they would see some use in Germany in the 1920s. In fact, it's interesting to note that some of the up-and-coming Nazi party members who were in the party from the very early days actually had scars from GL-18 use as well as from fencing sabers. So interesting that you see this continuing outside of France. In fact, use of these weapons would kind of become a global thing. The French had massive stockpiles of them at the end of the war, not surprisingly, and they started actually providing them as military aid to other countries, as they did with Chochas and Berthiers and many other munitions and armaments. So a lot of these actually went to Russia. They were used there. They also inspired a Russian copy during the Russian Civil War, which was named this. I can't pronounce Cyrillic, but they were used there. They were then also provided, the leftovers provided by Russia to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And ultimately, even to this day, they continue to pop up in conflicts through some of the old French colonial mandates in North Africa. So overall, really a fascinating history to what appears at first glance to be a pretty simple and basic weapon. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you're still watching at this point, hopefully you realize that this has been a complete April Fool's hoax, which was incredibly fun to put together. And hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Again, big thanks to Staghounds for helping me put this one together. Tune in tomorrow and we'll go back to real, actual weapons. Thanks for watching.